you. So welcome everyone. Welcome those of you who are joining us online. And thank you for everyone in the room for coming this bright sunny morning in Edinburgh. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Frances Guy. I'm Chief Executive of Scotland's International Development Alliance. And you'll see a wee bit of me this morning, but I'll do my best not to monopolise things. Our spring conference aims to offer an opportunity for members to work together, which you seem to be very good at, on issues that you've told us that you're interested in. But of course, our plans for this conference started to be drawn up before the dramatic cuts to overseas aid in the last 2 months. But if we're honest, many people all around the world have been arguing that there should be change in how aid is delivered, and they've been arguing this for more than 20 years. It's just that cutting 60% of the world's humanitarian funding over the course of a few weeks is a very brutal way to achieve that change. And it will result in thousands of unnecessary deaths and some immediate challenges which we're already seeing in Myanmar and elsewhere. I've heard some people describe workers in international development as behaving like we're on the Titanic, like we're carrying on with the music while all the signs around are of imminent collapse. I don't think that's fair, because while we might not have understood the full impact of what's going on, it is vital that we all continue to work to save lives. And those suffering in Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Gaza, Myanmar, and elsewhere should not, and do not, in fact, depend for survival on the whims of some of the world's richest men. People in Scotland have always been generous in their support for those in need and have a strong sense of social injustice, as we will see from some of the data that Sumin Oh is going to share with us shortly. Our duty is to carry on helping those in need while simultaneously arguing for system change that will undo these dangerous global dependencies that have led to today's desperate situation. I could go on, as you've realised, but that isn't my role today. So let me just give you a quick idea of the structure of the day. We'll start with some remarks from Kirsty Smith, who's chair of BOND. And for those of you like me who never remember what BOND stands for, it stands for British Overseas NGOs for Development. At SIDA, Scotland's International Development Alliance, we often refer to BOND as our big sister organisation working at a UK level. But there are some key differences. SIDA's membership includes many smaller organisations that are much smaller than those in BOND. And we are open literally to anyone interested in global sustainable development. So universities, private sector, social enterprises and individuals, you're all very welcome. After we've heard from Kirsty, we will look at public attitudes and engagement with Sumin Oh from the Development Engagement Lab, with an opportunity for questions and discussions during and after her presentation. We'll then have a quick coffee break, and we'll return here into this plenary room for a panel discussion with an amazing panel to look at different ways of reaching out to the public. So based on the earlier discussion. And then we will have 3 workshops running at the same time. You chose your workshop, I hope, when you registered, but if you've forgotten, it is on your name badge. So that's just a wee reminder. The 3 workshops are Workshop 1, how can Scotland be a responsible global citizen, which will be upstairs in the Scott room. Workshop 2, AI strategy for INGOs, which is also upstairs in the Burns room. And workshop 3, advocacy development and 2026, which will be in here. Our aim is to finish all of that by 1:30 so that you can have lunch, carry on speaking to each other, and still get loads of time to enjoy the sunshine in the afternoon. This will require some good timekeeping. And I can hear those of you who were here last year sighing, because and just a warning to any of the speakers, The big piece of feedback that I got from last year was that I need to be much more ruthless with speakers who go over time. So that's my endeavor this morning. Couple of practical issues. We're not expecting a fire alarm. So if the alarm, we're not expecting a drill at least, and we're not expecting an alarm either, but if it goes off, that means please go out through the exits. There's one at the back and there's some at the front. You will have somebody to marshal you. The idea is you go across the road. I realise that there's lots of construction going on, so those instructions are not quite as explicit as they should be. Hopefully we'll be okay. There are toilets on every floor of the building beside the stairs, so if it gets a bit congested, feel free to go upstairs. Wi-Fi is hopefully on your table. If you have any queries, please speak to any member of SIDA at the registration desk or grab us anywhere you see us. And then some of you will be familiar with this. For questions and answers, we'll be using Slido so that people online can join in, and also so that you can pose some questions when you think of it and upvote other people's questions at the same time. I'll do my best to navigate. The QR code is on screen now, and it was also in the information email that was sent to you yesterday. So thank you for joining us. Thanks in advance to all our speakers and to the facilitators of the workshops. Thanks also to our headline sponsors, WaterAid and StoneX, and to our exhibitors, HealthLink 360, Scotland Malawi Partnership, SCVO, the SIDA Diaspora Group for Global Citizenship, and the Scottish Government's International Development Team. Please do speak to them in the breaks. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Kirsty Smith. Kirsty might be familiar to some of you as Director of CBM, the UK's disability charity, who have offices in Edinburgh and Cambridge, and who I think one could say, honestly, have actively influenced how Scottish climate justice funding has been spent, ensuring that it's been spent to help the most vulnerable. And they also actively hold us all to account for our commitments to leave no one behind. So thank you for that. Kirsty started her role as chair of Bond in December 24. She's currently a member of the FCDO's External Disability Challenge Board. Thank you, Kirsty. Thank you for coming today to join us. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning online. I'm not sure where to look for online people. Good morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much. Francis has just done the most brilliant introduction, because it will feed into a lot of the things that I would like to share with you over the next few minutes. And because I come here with a dual hat, both from the CBM perspective and from the Bond perspective, I will be covering both inclusion, but also the broader sector. And I have to say, I am as overwhelmed as everybody else in this room. We are living in interesting times. Challenging, exciting, a bit overwhelming. Bond has been very quick to galvanise action across the sector in response to the surprise announcements of the decimation to the UK's development budget. So I want you to just explore what might be some effective ways for us to respond as a sector, and you may not think of yourselves as a sector, but I think everybody in this room is an agent for social justice, whichever organisation you belong to. And what can we do as individual organisations? So as a movement and as an individual organisation. Let's just take a look at the stark facts. So these are the cuts. And when you see them in black and white, you realise just how damaging and devastating these cuts are going to be. And I think it is no exaggeration, as Francis said, thousands of people will die as a direct result of this, but also because of similar trends that we see in other European countries who are now citing the UK and following suit. Together, these 3 years of cuts will total 14 billion. That is a 40% reduction, and it will take us to the lowest level of ODA for 25 years. And I feel slightly embarrassed, actually, that I have allowed this to happen in my lifetime, that I have been part of a movement that has allowed this to happen. This becomes even more shocking when you factor in that international climate finance will continue to be drawn from that amount. It's not additional to that amount. And however, there are bright sparks. And I think some of those bright sparks are actually in this room. Research by Oxfam, by Greenpeace, by Christian Aid, and other organisations indicate that there is public support. There is growing public support against the cuts, and there is growing support in the public, for example, to make polluters pay for climate financing. That's fossil fuel companies, that's wealthy individuals. So I think we need to build on the bright sparks and make them fires. It's possible that the UK government may continue with some of its planned humanitarian spend. They may continue with some projects which they deem value for money. And I'm going to talk later about what value for money really means. They may continue with things which mitigate reputational risk and which mitigate risk of harm while responsibly exiting a programme. Now, any of us who know what exiting a programme feels like know that it's very, very difficult to do that without very much risk. You can see that all of those qualifications make keeping any kind of aid going quite challenging. I'm not going to go into detail about the US, but let's just say that at least 80% of USA's budget has completely disappeared. Bond did a survey and 70 members replied. And some of the things that they told us were really, really shocking. The most affected programmes are those humanitarian aid, health, and climate change. If I take just one example within the health sector, international funding for HIV has been crucial in reducing new transmissions and deaths. And a Lancet report that just came out last week suggests that we will surge back to the HIV levels that were present in the 1990s because of these cuts. If anybody was alive in the 1990s and remembers how high those figures were, that really brings it home, doesn't it? Some INGOs, but also many of our local partners, those who are at the coalface, have been deeply affected by these cuts already. Some have already closed. Others are at risk or they have frozen programmes. And we know that as soon as you freeze something, it's really hard to start it up again, even if the USA cuts are actually not as scathing as they appear to be. Some of the most shocking things that I've heard have been that USA can sometimes play a tiny part in a much, much bigger programme. So I heard about people who were doing TB work, and they said that the USA funding was only paying for the transport to get the TB tests from the place where they were actually taken to the place where they were going to be analysed. So people were queuing up to have their test, and the tests could not actually go to the centre to be analysed. And I also heard shocking things like children coming for inoculations, and when the stop work order came, them literally going to a queue and saying, you from child 3, everybody else go home. So what are we doing about it? Some organisations in the room may already have had to start scaling back. You may have been reallocating your budgets. You may be cutting jobs. You certainly are probably thinking about cutting costs. CBM has been looking for some time about how we diversify, how we move away from this reliance on government funding. It is important to remember, and this is from a disability organisation, but anybody who works with any kind of marginalised group, cuts don't affect everybody the same. They tend to impact most on those who are already marginalised. So an example of that would be when the budget was cut by a third in 2021 to 2022, gender funding was actually cut by a half. So the impact is greater on those who are already marginalised. So what are our options? What could we do to respond? Because that's why we're all in this room, because we still think that there are ways for us to have a positive impact. I think that this is a moment for agents for social change to collectively try to do something different. There's a tendency, I think, for us to become defensive, for us to start saying, well, we have to continue doing what we've done. We'll just do less with a smaller budget. There's also a danger we start to compete with each other. Each one of us thinks our cause is the most important. But if my climate cause is given funding, your TB cause may lose out. If your orphanage gets funding, your primary school may lose out. We cannot compete with each other now. This is a time for us to come together. I think that we can use this crisis to accelerate some of the necessary trends that we've probably been talking about for way too long. Things like localization. How many of us have really fundamentally embraced localization in a way that has transformed our organizations? How many of us have actually moved far enough away from a dependency on aid? How many of us have really thought about that shift to decolonization, to shifting power, to building relationships with other adjacent networks? And lastly, how have we failed so badly to persuade the public? I am not embarrassed about what I do. I am deeply proud of the work that I do. And yet it's almost become a swear word to say that you work for an INGO, as if somehow it's embarrassing, as if somehow we're inefficient, when actually I know that we are usually low cost, high impact, fantastic relationships with local implementing partners. And we have to own that and be proud. This is not a moment to shrink. It's a moment to step out into the sun and say, yes, we may have got it wrong. There may be things that we could do better, but we are still a very important part of a movement. Maybe our role needs to change within that movement, but we're still important to it. And I don't know about you, but certainly CBM's partners have never ever said to us, we don't want you to exist. We want you to be there, maybe a little bit differently, but we want you to be there. And I think that organisations like Bond and like the Scottish Alliance have a really key role to play in ensuring that we embrace that agenda. So the first point that I'm making today is, let us think about how we can work better together. The transition may be hard and we may need to support each other, but it is a vital way to move forward. Bond has done the research to find that support for the aid cuts has, it was actually quite high when it was first announced. The UK public said, yes, we agree with this, because it was placed as we either defend the UK or we had aid. Those were the kind of polar opposites that were placed in front of people. And actually now, I think, largely because a lot of organisations have done such great advocacy, there's a much better understanding that it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think there is also the need for us to fight. But I think we have to be more sophisticated. We've put a lot of energy over the last few years to fighting for 0.7. That has been a really significant focus of our advocacy. We must stay at 0.7. And I think we're past that now. We're not going to go back to 0.7. So let's not invest our energy in that argument. But let's put our argument into, if we're going down to 0.5, 0.3, how can we make the 0.3 be spent in the best, most impactful way? We want to increase impact and we want to limit damage. And I think, I don't know about in Scotland, but certainly in England, we have made assumptions about the Labour Party. We assumed they shared our ideological platform and therefore we didn't need to advocate to them, and how wrong we were. As I say, we are living in interesting times. However, unite and fight, be proud. And don't forget, 1p in every pound is not a lot of money. We are a very wealthy island. Most of us have seen firsthand what it looks like in northeast Zambia, in the south of Malawi, in Sudan. We have seen the reality of people's lives that many people in Scotland have never, ever experienced. And we can tell that story in a compelling way. But we do need to do that in a coordinated fashion. So, what are some of the things that we can actually do? Mitigate. We may not be able to prevent that downward trend to 9 billion, but we can slow it down. And that is, I think, where we could put our efforts into advocacy, by encouraging the government not to have a cliff edge whereby aid just falls off, but to do it in a strategic way that the US absolutely did not. Can we put pressure on the government to say, just slow it down? Let's think through how to do this in a way that is least damaging. Slightly contentiously, we know that about a third of the ODA budget was paying for in-country refugee costs. And we are the most expensive European nation in terms of, we have not found an effective way to pay for refugee costs. Very vulnerable people living in hotels at massively high cost, and the government has not found a way to address that. Now, times are changing so fast that when I wrote this, our aid was still tied to refugee costs. So if refugee costs went down, the potential for aid went up. And then suddenly they announced that they're untying them. So I was like, oh man, I've got to change my slides. Now they're not tied to each other. So any savings that are made in refugee costs will go into the Treasury. We could say, if you make cuts in refugee costs, give it back to ODA. You have cut it so drastically and so detrimentally. At least give us that. Again, slightly contentially, British international investment receives a very significant amount of the funding that the British government gives out. But that funding doesn't go to the lowest income countries or fragile states. It goes to largely 5 middle-income countries. That's Egypt, India, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Only 17% goes to the poorest countries. There are very significant savings to be made if some of that money can be diverted. I am not an expert in BII, but there are organisations in this room who are. And there's lots and lots of stuff written about it, and Bond can certainly help us to understand why this is a good campaigning technique. And penultimately, we need to set out a transparent process to really think through with the government, what are the anticipated cuts going to do, And what do we need to prioritise within them? There will be some hard choices. But if we can make that process transparent, that will really help to ensure that we're not competing as much as possible, but that we are having the biggest impact. And one of the ways that we can do that, you won't be surprised to hear me saying, as I come from an inclusion organisation, is to prioritise leave no one behind. So Leave No One Behind is the umbrella movement that tries to focus on the most marginalised. I mentioned at the beginning value for money. Value for money tends to come with we will reach the highest number of people in the easiest way. Who loses out then? The people who are the most difficult to reach. People with disabilities, rural women, older women. So those who are marginalised by society and sometimes doubly or trebly marginalised. And I would really implore you, as organisations who will be facing difficult choices, not to allow yourselves to be pushed into a situation where you reach the easiest, the most quick, the most probably wealthy, the most able to access support. Please remember that the most marginalised continue with all the barriers that they faced before, but with that double whammy of a greater impact of aid cuts. So I think that times like this encourage us to be bold. I went to an absolutely brilliant talk last week by Kate Rayworth, who wrote the Donut Economics book. She's the most, I want to be her when I grow up. She's just so inspiring. And when you listen to her, you just think anything is possible. And she included this quote by the American economist Friedman: "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. I think that's our job, to develop alternatives to existing policies and structures. We are 20 years into Scottish Government funding, and we are 25 years into the Scottish Alliance existing. Both have been incredible champions for really significant change in the world. And I think that Scottish people have a very elevated sense of social justice. This is the time to demonstrate real leadership. So the first one was unite. The second one was fight. The third one was mitigate. My fourth one is pivot. I heard the phrase last week, the first time, hidden handbrakes. I never heard that phrase before. But there are a number of hidden handbrakes that make it difficult for us to change existing structures. Structures that actually keep people poor. I put 3 things on the board here that I don't know anything about. But that's because I am feeling the need to do things differently. CBM is a disability inclusion organisation. We are focused on making healthcare accessible, making education accessible, improving advocacy on disability inclusion. For the first time, I'm now thinking, I need to start doing something else. I need to start addressing the systematic barriers that are keeping people poor, despite all of the brilliant work that organisations like CBM are doing. So now I'm going to attempt to talk about things I don't know anything about, because I want to encourage your organisation to think about whether it's time for you to pivot too. Can you carry on doing the brilliant work that you do, but also add an element of advocacy? And there are organisations that can help us. So the first one is addressing debt relief Christian Aid has just released the most brilliant report, which is called Between Life and Debt. And they quote that 34 African countries spend more on external debt repayments than on healthcare and education put together. The total external debt by all African countries in 2024 was $104 billion. That's twice the amount they received in aid. So we're giving aid with one hand and they're repaying it double. I was in Zambia when the US aid cuts happened, and I was there with my head in my hands. And the Zambian advocacy organisation that I was with was like, if we could just address illicit tax flows, we wouldn't need ODA. So my second thing is illicit tax flows. And Bond has released some great material. I think Oxfam is also working on this. There are some organisations that are really working hard on changing the systems that are allowing multinationals to get away with murder. And then lastly, climate justice. The IIED has invented a way to try to swap. It's called a debt for climate and nature swap. This is an underused tool for addressing the problems facing low-income countries: crippling debt, the impact of climate change, and biodiversity loss. I'm hoping that this presentation will be shared, and I will put the link in that organisation because the IIED can explain it much better than I can. Why did I put these in this slide when I don't know what I'm talking about? Because I really feel this is the moment for us to be bold. It's time for me to do something differently. It doesn't matter how many brilliant CBN projects I get if I cannot fund them. And I really, really want to find alternative ways of making miracles happen. So I'm going to start exploring some of these. So I will finish by just reminding you, it's time for us to work together. This is not a time for us to be competing with each other. There has never been a moment when it's been more important for us as actors for social justice to unite. The second one is be proud, fight, but don't fight for 0.7. Fight for the 0.3 to be spent better or differently, or for injustices to be overcome. The third one is mitigate. And the slide in this presentation gives you some ways to mitigate. If the cuts have to happen, let them be done well. And fourthly, pivot. This is the time to be bold. Just to cite Friedman again, I'm asking you, is this the time to make the politically impossible become the politically inevitable? Thank you very much.
You, Kirsty. Unfortunately, we're now already over time, so I failed in my first endeavour. I have 3 questions online, and one is about how, on Slido at least, it may come from the room, about how we can support, how organisations like SIDA and Bond can help. I think Kirsty answered some of that already. We will continue to share ideas and offer support. One is about in reducing funding for in-country refugees. I think that's a separate question, so I'm going to dodge that one. And the other one, which has some markup, which is a pushback, I'm afraid, Kirsty, on the idea that we should continue to argue for 0.7, because actually the government has committed that they will do that when time allows, and we shouldn't actually allow them to get away with it, basically. But I think Kirsty's point, if I can paraphrase it, is that we shouldn't spend all our effort on that. We should be doing some of these other things. So I'm just ventriloquizing that. I'm going to move on because I'm going to stick to my attempt to keep to time. And Sumin O from the Development Engagement Lab will hopefully give us some insights on how we might bring the public with us and how we don't need to be ashamed that we failed to do that and how there's some ways forward on that. She will explain much better than I can about the work, and we'll have some breaks for questions in the middle. So Thank you. Over to you, Sue.
Morning, everyone. It's really great to be in Edinburgh, beautiful city, and to meet you all. And thank you for having me. My name is Sumin Oh, and I am the Deputy Director of Development Engagement Lab. We are a research organization funded by the Gates Foundation, and we study public engagement and attitudes towards global poverty and development. And in today's presentation, I will be walking you through some of the latest insights and trends around the Scottish public attitudes and engagement with aid and global development. Before we go on, just a quick note that all the insights, all the data, all the decks are public good and are available on our website and will be circulated after the event as well. So there are three key insights that I would like to leave you with by the end of this presentation. First, the Scottish public's support for ODA is on a downward trend, and their engagement with global poverty and development is low. Secondly, the engagement journey of the Scottish public is not a linear journey upwards. They move up and down the engagement ladder. Their movement upward is enabled by their concern for poverty and personal morality around helping others in developing countries. And their movement downward is driven by concern for wastage and inefficiency of aid. So what we can glean here is that the Scottish public needs convincing that aid works and aid delivers. So let's dig into the data. So Development Engagement Lab tracks two key sets of KPIs. One around public engagement with global poverty and development, and another around public attitudes and opinion around this topic. So first, where is the Scottish public at with regards to engagement around global poverty and development? Using a battery of 10 key actions that they can take to support global poverty and development, we are able to see where they're at. So it ranges from reading, watching, or listening to the news around the topic, to donating to international development NGOs and charities working on this topic. So the first set of actions have to do with information consumption around global poverty and development. So as you can see here, 55% of the Scottish public have read, watched, or listened to the news around the topic. 40% have discussed with others, and a much lower percent of 14% have shared it with others. The second set of actions have to do with being transactionally engaged with this topic. So 24%, just under a quarter of the Scottish public have purchased or boycotted in support of the cause. So for instance, shopping at charity shops that support international development. And 17% have donated to international development NGOs and charities. And when we look at the trend over donations over the course of the 6 years that we have data, starting from 2019 to 2025, we see that there are two key trends that can stand out. First, donations go up and down, and the spikes up are usually anchored around big international events and donation appeals there too. For instance, the war in Ukraine and Israel and Gaza. And the second trend that does stand out is that donations are on a downward trend. And when we look at the data further back in the first phase of DEL, it was around in the upper 30s, and now we're down at 17% in Scotland. So that's a huge cut in public's donations towards international development NGOs. And the final set of actions are purposive actions that the public can take around global poverty and development. We see that 13% have used their voice by, for instance, signing a petition to influence the issue. 8% have engaged with development organizations working on the issue by, for instance, signing up to their newsletters. And less than 5% have volunteered, contacted their MPs, or participated in larger events in support of the issue. Moving on to the second set of KPIs, we look at public opinion and attitudes towards global issues, including global poverty and development. We ask the public, what are the issues that are front and center of your mind? What is the greatest issue of your concern from a list of 10 presented to them around global issues? And for the Scottish public, as well as the English and the Welsh publics, economic crises, job security, and wages rank the top. And we add this question because it provides us insight as to what's front and center of the public's mind and can also help us explain the trends and attitudes and engagement with our issues. And so economic crises, job security, and wages rank the top. And in Scotland, concern for inequality between the rich and the poor is the second top issue at 45%. And this is in contrast to England and Wales, where immigration, migration, and refugees is the second top issue of their concern. For both Scotland and the rest of the UK, war, conflict, and terrorism ranks third on the list. 35% of the public are concerned about these issues. And what we see here over time is that the top 3 issues are crowding out other issues like climate change over time. As they increase other issues, there's a trade-off, and climate change ranks lower in the issue of concern. However, what's interesting to see is that basic needs for developing countries is consistently around 30% in Scotland as well as England and Wales. So basic needs are things like education, health, clean water, and hunger in developing countries. And that doesn't seem to change over time. So perhaps, happy to hear your thoughts on this. There's perhaps a latent concern that doesn't change with regardless of what's happening in the world. We track other attitudes and opinions around aid, and there are 3 key things that I would like to highlight from the grid here. First is that majority of the Scottish public are concerned about the levels of poverty in poor countries. 54% are concerned. In contrast to that, 21% think that development aid is effective or very effective, and 31% say that they have a degree of trust in international development, NGOs, and charities. But despair not, the public does think, half of the public thinks that NGOs and charities can make a difference to reducing global poverty, and that hasn't changed over time. The last data point around key attitudes towards poverty and development is aid support. So 47% of the Scottish public think that we should support aid measured as keeping or increasing the current aid budget. And the data are from January of 2025, the 47%. A few key trends can also be seen here. The major one being that it's on a downward trend, especially in Scotland. The fall is quite stark, from 63% in June of 2022, or from 56% more recently in January of 2024. It has fallen down to less than half of the Scottish population being supportive of aid. And the trend is parallel in the rest of the country, and as you may imagine, other parts of the world, the aid donor world. So before we get to the questions, what do we learn from the data around public engagement attitudes? What we see is that public support for aid and development is under pressure. Domestic issues like economic crises, inequality, immigration, as well as international issues like war, conflict, and terrorism are front and center of people's minds. And coupled with that, low trust in the effectiveness of aid and in the NGOs are putting a greater pressure on their support and engagement with ODA. With that, I'd like to pause here for a few perhaps clarifying questions or comments. If we have any from online, happy to take them as well.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So the theory is that the microphones can catch you, so try.
I wanted to ask whether, as part of the research process, there were any questions relating to trade. So related to trade, because basically I was interested in people's understanding of trade as being imbalanced and being unfair, because I think there's been a rising understanding of much of international trade, various different ways extract money from the majority world into the West. So I'm just interested about the questions you ask and whether there was a need to get an understanding of what the public understands as it's really in that relationship to aid, because people say, oh, we are poor, so why are we giving money away? But they're not understanding what the realities of the kind of trade issues are, that we're actually extracting huge amounts, and it's really about global and local health, wealth inequalities.
Yeah, that's a really great point. We don't ask specifically about trade, but we are designing a new set of questions, as Kirsty mentioned, we change the way we even try to understand the public. And so that's definitely a question that we are thinking about including in the next phase of our surveys. Yeah.
There's a question online. I don't know if it's someone in the room. If it's someone in the room happy that they show themselves, about sample sizes. Was that somebody in the room? But I think it would be of interest to many. Can you tell us something about the sample size for the research? And yeah, is this a weighted Scottish sample, or is it a subsection of your UK one?
Our data come from 8,000 respondents in the UK, and about 1,000 is from Scotland. But some of the data, so the tracking data that we track every twice a year, that is from a smaller sample of 2,000 in the UK and a much smaller size in Scotland. So it would be about 300, but the data are weighted to be nationally represented. And so the data that I'm showing you are all from Scotland only, compared with England and Wales. Yeah.
Did you attempt to find out whether people's views are related to their consumption of media? So looking at what newspapers they read and social media they followed.
Yeah. That's a really, really great question, and we are going to look at that in the next phase. But what we have seen in previous research is that majority of the public consume their information about global poverty and development from traditional news media, including radio. And so you can imagine what kind of narratives are portrayed in the traditional media. Yeah, hope that answers your question. Yep.
Just ask, was there any further breakdown on like demographics? There really like age, part of the country, rural, urban location, things like that?
So geographically, the current largest is the country, Scotland, but we do have breakdowns by age, gender, partisanship, level of education. And when we look at support for aid, I don't show it in the slides, but younger, university educated thoughts are more in support of aid. Labour and Lib Dem supporters are also supportive of aid based on our sample. Yeah.
There's a run of questions about, is there any indication that some of your participation has decreased over time? And any evidence that Scots recognise a link between the climate emergency and growing conflict?
I'm not exactly sure if what they're asking about participation, but if you're talking about panel attrition, so we have a panel data. So from wave one, we revisit wave one respondents in 2019 and ask them to respond to wave two, same question. So we were able to track their responses over the course of 6 years. But of course, some people fall off. About 30% of the wave one respondents fall off. And so we have to top them up with new data. However, there are still a large chunk of population that we have carried through the 6 years and can see their internal change over time. And we have some cool analysis that we can show after this Q&A. What was climate change and conflict? We don't have currently research on climate change and conflict, but we did recently conduct an experiment to see if we connect climate change with our issues of global poverty and development, if we can move them along, because climate change has traditionally enjoyed higher levels of concern and support in the UK. And so if we tell them, hey, climate change can come knock on your, can have knock-on effect in developing countries, and that can also impact you at your door through health, through cost of living, they become a bit more concerned about our issues. And so that's research that's available on our website for your perusal.
So I'm conscious that you've also got some stuff to show us about the pathway, which kind of answers some of those questions. There's lots of questions, but I think we'll let you do the next bit and then we'll get to some more questions. Okay, thank you.
So I have given you a snapshot of where the public is at with regards to engagement with global poverty and development. But I'd like to pose 3 questions in the next section. First, is there an evidence of an engagement journey of the Scottish public? And if so, how does it look like? And do individuals move up and down the ladder? And if so, what moves them up and down the ladder? So that's the exam question. I've given you the answer in the beginning, but I'll walk you through the analysis. So remember the battery of 10 actions that I have shown you the results for. We're able to turn responses to these 10 actions into groups or segments of the population, ranging from being totally disengaged with global poverty and development, which consists the largest segment of the Scottish population, to being fully engaged or more purposively engaged, those that take more purposive actions from the list of 10. Oh. Same colors here. Well, when we look at the trends over time and the breakdown of the population of the segments, if the colors were there, we would see that the distribution of the segments remains stable. So totally disengaged and marginally disengaged, those who are only consuming information about global poverty and development, remain the largest segments of the population year on year. However, if the colors were there, we will also see that there are lines in between these groups over time going up and down. So what this means is that individuals aren't just staying in their group year on year. They can move out of their group. They can also move down into a lower engagement. Okay? So that's the second insight. If the colors were there, would present. And so the key message that I wanted to share with you is that engagement journey is not a linear one. People move in and out of their segment groups. And we're able to capture their movement in and out of groups using this chart on the left. So what this shows is the percentage of each segment that stays in their segment. So if I am a totally disengaged person in year 1, do I stay as totally engaged person? Do I move up the ladder? Do I move down the ladder? And so that's what this shows. Okay. And there are 3 insights that we can draw from here. First, segments are sticky and stable, especially at lower levels of engagement. So the 66% of people who were totally disengaged in 1 year stay totally disengaged in the next year. Likewise, for people who are marginally engaged, over 50% who are marginally engaged, just consuming information, stay marginally engaged in the next year. Second insight is that a small percentage of the population does climb up the engagement ladder. Around 16% to 22%, they move up the engagement ladder, but just one step at a time. Okay. And a larger percentage climb down the engagement ladder, but also one step at a time. But when we group these segments together into low levels of engagement and higher levels of engagement, we have an interesting story to tell here as well. So when people were in the low engagement, the first three segments, so people who are just marginally engaged or totally disengaged with global poverty and development, 84% stay in that low engagement year on year. And it's very, very hard to move them. Only 16% move to higher engagement segments. But on the flip side, if you begin being a higher engaged person, 69% of them stay in that higher engagement group. They may be changing their repertoire of actions. They may be donating 1 year and then signing petitions another year, and vice versa, changing the repertoire of actions, but they stay in the high engaged group, 70% of them. So that's another insight to take away from our transitions or engagement journey. So the exam question is, what drives them up and down this engagement ladder? There are three drivers of upward movement in the engagement ladder. First is values, and they are the intrinsic motives to move the public up the engagement ladder, to engage with the issue more. Concern for global poverty, morality, personal sense of duty that it is the right thing to do, and perception that it is morally right for the UK to be providing aid to developing countries. And lastly, a sense of guilt. They would feel guilty if they didn't help others in poor countries. Second is benefits. When they perceive that aid helps improve lives through the provision of basic needs like water, sanitation, and healthcare, they're more likely to engage with the issue. And the last is a sense of global connectedness. When they feel or perceive that whatever happens in the developing world impacts them too, it encourages them to engage with global poverty and development. But on the flip side, there are drivers of downward movement, and there are two. First is the perception that aid is not going to the intended recipients. And second, the perception that aid is spent on programs that don't help reduce poverty. For the Scottish public, as with the English and Welsh public, the priority areas of aid are around basic needs. They want aid money to be spent on water, education, and healthcare. Issues like debt relief, infrastructure, energy, gender, very low in their priorities for aid. And so this could be communicating with their priority areas as well.
Could you say that one again? Which ones rank low for them? Gender?
So from a list of 15, gender, infrastructure, energy, debt relief are four of the lowest that rank on the list of 15. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And these downward drivers resonate also with the aid skeptics, who consist 53% of the Scottish population. 94% of aid skeptics think aid is ineffective. 87% say that they do not trust INGOs, and 70% say that they do not trust the UK government. So what works with them? What works with them? Frames that resonate with the aid skeptics are similar to the drivers of engagement. First is soft morality. Majority, 57% of aid skeptics agree that helping people is the right thing to do. And the same percent thinks that everyone in the world should be treated equally. So soft morality around justice, equality, they work with aid skeptics. Basic needs also works with aid skeptics. 35% agree or strongly agree that aid improves lives through providing access to basic needs. On the flip side, there are some frames that do not resonate with the aid skeptics. And first is around countries' moral duty, moral imperative around UK providing aid to other countries. The second set of frames that do not resonate with aid skeptics is around instrumentality of aid beyond basic needs. So over 80% disagree that aid helps Britain's political influence, and 92% disagree that aid helps promote Britain's national security. And lastly, only 14% agree that aid increases economic growth in poor countries, perhaps because they think that it's not going to the places that will do so. Yeah. So, summing up, we see that the Scottish public needs convincing that aid works, especially around poverty reduction, and that aid delivers, especially the basic needs in developing countries. Morality does work, but it needs to strike the right tone, especially with the aid skeptic. Soft morality works, but moral imperatives do not work. And lastly, values of fairness, justice, and equality drive engagement across all audiences in Scotland. So that's all I have for you today, and I am happy to pass it on to Francis for discussion.
There's a few clarifications I think are required about how often you do this data and how long you've been doing it for, and how it correlates with recent cuts and Trump, because I think your recent data is before that. So maybe you could just clarify that, because there's quite a few questions in that space.
So we have been conducting our surveys since 2019 of September. And we run tracker the KPIs 3 times a year, and we run a deeper analysis of a larger sample of 8,000 once every year. And so there are 6 panel surveys and lots of tracker data along the way to monitor granular changes over time. We did run the survey, the latest one in January of 2025, and that gave us a good platform to see how the public has changed in light of the US aid cuts as well as UK aid cuts. So as of now, the surveys are in the field to understand whether and how the public's support has changed regarding aid in the course of 3 months. So stay in tune.
Okay, and those who are asking for more details, it is all available on their website. So if you want to look into what issues and all of that stuff, we'll share that link, and maybe we can share it with people online. So, we'll not take up time with that now. And Lewis has a burning question. Go for it.
I do. Thanks. That was really interesting. I suppose quite clearly the economic and I suppose disposable incomes that result from the economic crises that many people in Scotland are facing clearly has a link implicitly to how we might feel about things overseas. And I wondered if you've done any analysis of that change over time of the disposable income or the perception of disposable pockets in Scotland versus how they feel about overseas development and specifically ODA.
So we have done an experiment around how they have felt as a result of cost of living crisis. So as you said, perceived disposable income, not the actual one, but it's about perception, right? The way you act is a result of your perceived income. And so when we have done that experiment, people felt that they felt worse off as a result of cost of living crisis, and they become less supportive of aid or giving to donations to other organizations in support of this issues. But when we do remind them that we are all in the same storm, but perhaps on different boats, where the worse off become even worse off as a result of cost of living crisis, they become more cognizant. Oh, okay, I may be feeling worse off, but there are people who are more in suffering out there. Then they become more willing to give. Yeah, so that's a back channel way of answering your question, but it does have an impact. Yeah.
Sorry, there's one more practical one which is gaining some interest. I don't know if it's from someone here, which is your analysis of elements into values, benefits, and global connections. Where did that come from? Did you create that, or yeah, how did you get to that as your 3 pointers?
Okay, so we have a battery of values that we ask, as well as perception of the costs and benefits of providing aid. And when we run the analysis, those are the 3 key significant variables that come up. There are other variables that do not come up. So for instance, aid helps economic growth in other countries that don't come up as the factor that drives engagement, for instance. That's not the main driver. Yeah.
One had the hand up, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's I think a little bit linked to Lewis's question. Are there trade-offs between a commitment to domestic social justice versus international social justice? So if you're really engaged in anti-poverty movements in Scotland, for example, or less likely to become engaged internationally?
That's an interesting question. And while we don't currently have the exact data point that speaks to it, academic research shows that when you are able to make the connection between the domestic issues and the international issues, you are likely to engage. But there is also literature on trade-offs. There is only a limited amount of resources and time that you can spend on domestic versus international issues. And that could be a reason. I'm not sure what you're seeing, but we see a segregation of individuals engaging in domestic versus international issues. Yeah.
Hi, I'm interested in the rising populism, which I think is something we really need to address. So I'm glad you raised that. And I just wondered if there was any interrogation into people's actual understanding of what the term aid means. Because I think you talked about, I think something like human rights funding, or, do people understand what aid really means? And also, do they understand the systemic causes of fragility? Because I'm interested in that. Maybe that's a sort of education thing we need to do.
Yeah. So do people understand what aid is? When we do, you're asking all of these questions that are currently in the field, and we would love to share with them the data when they come out. But when we do ask them, not about aid in particular, but about SDGs, there is a very low understanding of these issues. Less than 10% of the public know what SDGs are, and aid is probably higher in terms of knowledge. We'll get back to you on that.
Could I just add to that? Because I think there's been a question as well about how much is aid in terms of what is it in real terms, and this notion, and we banter about the 0.7% or whatever, but the issue around how much people actually understand the quantifiable value of aid.
Yeah, there is an overestimation around the world around how much is spent on ODA. But in our question, the one that tracks aid support, we give them the actual percentage of GNI that's spent on aid. Would you like to keep it or increase it? And so twofold answer. They overestimate for sure.
There's a few, I'll come to you, but there's a few questions about if it's so hard to move people from being overly skeptic, should we be concentrating on keeping those who are supportive rather than spending energy on those who are skeptical? I'm not sure if that's a fair question to you or a question for the floor.
So when we do. So it is obviously a question for you more than it is for me about when we look at the public moving up and down the engagement ladder, quite a bit of percentage moves out of being totally disengaged into being marginally engaged. And then a chain of events can happen after they become even so slightly engaged with global poverty and development. It is obviously very hard to move them up the ladder into the high engagement group, but personally, I think it's worthwhile to push them into the high engagement group because they will stay there. So they take actions and they gain more belief that this is the right thing to do because morality and sense of duty is a driver of their engagement. And so that can have a trickle down effect.
Thank you. I'm going to take one question, John, go on. I'll take two of you then, go on.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I was just interested to know whether you've saw participation in the research affecting journeys up and down the ladder. The effect of taking part in the research.
That's a
moving people up and down.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. But when we do see people, I wish there were colors in that previous bar chart. When we see the distribution of the segments over time, it stays quite similar. So if we were to take the hypothesis of does participation in the research move them up the ladder, that we would see an increasing engagement with global poverty and development, but we don't see that. So we're just understanding where they are more than moving them per se. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you. This is really interesting. We're doing quite a lot of thinking on this in the Scottish Government as well, and a lot of what you said tallies with that. One thought on that narrative point, one of the things we're seeing in the research is that language like SDGs, good global citizenship, aid just doesn't land with people. That these amorphous topics that people find inconceivable, that basic needs stuff clearly does. I was really interested by that chart, that time series chart you showed in the first presentation about support for aid. And I think you said in 2022 we had like a high watermark, 63%. That was, it looked like to me about 3 months after the invasion of Ukraine. It was also probably about 6 months after COP26. So it's just something about understanding when do we get that engagement from the public? How sensitive is that to global crises, etc.? You know, equally, you've got Middle East crisis now, but people probably feel really powerless on that and what they can do. So I'm just kind of interested in how do global events, I suppose, shape these things, and also that kind of domestic participation and how that influences it.
Domestic publics are quite reactive to international events, but they're also myopic. Their support or donations kind of tail off when that salience is gone. And so you're absolutely right that it does match with the international events. There was one previous one around 8 cuts in 2021 where we saw a large spike, about 10 percentage points in support for aid in England, Wales, as well as Scotland. And we gather that it is due to the salience of the topic and the issue, as well as the NGOs making the case for aid. Now, whether we will see a similar effect, we will see in the data, but I'd love to chat with you more about what we're expecting as a result of aid.
Thank you. Please join me in thank you, Sumin, for and to thank the Development Engagement Lab for making all that information available. So those of you who do want to drill down a bit, you can do so, and it's all there. We're going to have a coffee break now. I will urge you to be back here for 11:15 sharp. We will then have a discussion from various different views about what we can do with some of this. So thank you. And everybody online, please join us afterwards for the panel session. Then we have Francisca Mutapie, who is Professor of Global Health, Infection and Immunity at the University of Edinburgh. She's also Deputy Director of TIBA Partnership, and TIBA stands for Tackling Infections to Benefit Africa. But cleverly, it also means to cure an infection in Swahili. So TIBA is an Africa-led, wide-ranging, multidisciplinary research program that explores and draws lessons from the ways that different African health systems tackle infectious diseases. Francisca is an award-winning global health expert empowering African scientists and policymakers to tackle infectious diseases and improve epidemic preparedness, prioritizing local needs and solutions. She sits on various funding, scientific, technical, and strategic advisory boards, including the WHO Africa Regional Directors Advisory Board and the FCDO's Science Advisory Group. So I'm looking forward to her perspectives. And we also have Mark, who I've lost. Sorry, Mark. Mark McAllister, who's organisational lead for strategic development at Public Health Scotland. Mark worked with the Scottish Government in 2018 to lead engagement on the new public health reform programme before moving to COSLA. I don't suppose that means this building's familiar, though. It is, okay. In 2020, with a focus on public health. Mark returned to Public Health Scotland in 2022 with responsibility for the organisation's approach to strategy, engagement and policy. Mark developed an interest in health inequalities while working in the East End of Glasgow. So you can see we're going to come at this from lots of different angles, but we're going to start from benefiting from WaterAid's recent experience. So over to you, Gemma.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to join you today and for the introduction. And sorry that my bio is a bit of a tongue twister. So I'm Gemma. I'm the Global and UK Director of Communications for WaterAid. For those that don't know too much about WaterAid, it was established over 40 years ago now by the UK water industry to ensure that the world, everyone, everywhere has access to clean water, decent toilets and good hygiene. We now work in 22 countries and we're supported by offices in the UK, Australia, US, Sweden, Canada, Japan and India. So what I was asked to share with you today is that we've just completed a brand refresh, and it really does connect to the panel discussion when we're starting to think about how we engage society. And the brand refresh was definitely looking at society as a whole, but there's so much we could draw on from the insight that was shared earlier. Get my clicker. Okay, so why a brand refresh? So millions of people still don't have access to clean water, decent toilets and good hygiene. We've got a new global strategy. It's a 10-year strategy with the most ambitious strategy to date to reach 400 million more people with clean water, decent toilets and good hygiene. It's a big project ahead of us, and we're operating in what we just discussed earlier, quite complex and difficult times. We had a brand that wasn't fit for purpose anymore. It's many things to many different people. It was quite, in one space we'll be talking about very detailed wash, but the general public didn't know what wash was. So we had to start to think again, what brings us back to our core purpose as WaterAid. And we really needed to work out what we needed to cut through with clarity. What was that one thing we wanted everyone we're working with to ensure we can meet our mission to take away about the cause and about WaterAid. And we needed that to be underpinned by the brand. So our approach, this is one of the most interesting projects I've had the privilege to work on. It was overseen by a global steering group, and that steering group was made up of representatives of how we segmented it into business to business, so the private sector side of our work, the consumer side of our work. So linking back into the public perception data we saw earlier, how is our brand showing up for the public? And that's not just the UK public, that's globally. We also had an employee survey of employee elements to the global steering group. We worked really closely with our advocacy and campaigning colleagues to ensure that the brand was fit for purpose for our campaigning and advocacy ambitions moving forwards. And most importantly, it was underpinned by the communities we work with. Interviews and insights were gathered from internal and external stakeholders globally. You can be a bit of an echo chamber sometimes when you're within an organisation and people have a lot of opinions about who you are and what you're there for, but actually you need to balance that with the external context as well. So we had an interview and insights gathering process that took place over a period of 2 months. And it really was a deep exploration of who we are and what is at the core of WaterAid. And I think it undid a lot of myths about who we thought we were. These are some of the takeaways that were part of this phase. It's time to think big. Water is more relevant and urgent than ever, but as a global issue, water is getting lost in the poly crisis. One of our partners said that only WaterAid can bring water to the global stage. Quite often, when you looked at the insight from the staff side with the brand insight stage, we're quite scared to take the lead, like let everyone else go ahead, we'll come up behind. But actually, what our partners were telling us, no, you need to lead from the front and we're going to come with you on this. Also, the data also showed that we could be bolder in our attitude and still be trusted. And that really resonates back to the public insight information earlier. Quite often, it can feel complicated, and we're living in a very complicated world. But we needed to ensure that the simplicity of what could be achieved with everyone ever having access to clean water was communicated by us as WaterAid. And the final one, and this came very strongly through our advocacy and campaigning strand, and also working with our country programmes teams, was as WaterAid collectively, we need to step into our power and stop apologising for being there, but stepping into it to enact change. So this brought us to our core belief. We need to position water as the essential foundation for progress. If everyone has it, we can transform the world. Without it, we cannot move forwards. And our core belief is that change starts with water. It was really interesting to hear this morning that water and sanitation is one of those basics that people actually do agree people should have access to. But then the other elements such as gender, education, access was sort of going down the list. But what we've been able to do with Change Starts with Water is put water at the centre, and then we talk about the ripple effect. If a school has access to clean water, girls can go to school. If mothers have access to healthcare facilities with clean water, they're going to have a much safer birth. So we've started to look at what you put at the centre as the route in for public engagement enables them you to talk about the much wider benefits. So when you talk about brand, people often just think of it as the logo and you've changed a few colours, but as you can see here, it's going much deeper into it than sometimes brand is given a bit of brand rep when you're talking about a brand refresh. So it does also impact on how we sound and how we look. So taking all of that information for the beginning stage, our personality and tone is that we are straightforward, we are easy to understand, we are people first, we are clear, we are direct. So we've got to try and move away from the acronyms that many of us use in this room on a daily basis, but really ensure that we are straightforward and people can really understand what we're trying to achieve. We're motivating. We're all about action. That came through in abundance at the insight stage. We're positive, striving for solutions. We're upbeat, we're passionate. And that really resonated this morning when you were talking about that need for action. We need to be here, we need to be driving, and that's really coming through in our brand profile moving forwards. We are determined, we're tireless, and we are focused. We're upfront about the scale of the task, and we're bold and we're resolute with it. We know that there has been fatigue, and we also saw that in the data we gathered together. Well, nothing's changing. This is always a problem. But I've given you money before and nothing's happening with it. Well, with our brand personality and how we show up as WaterAid moving forward, we really want to dispel that myth and make sure we're reporting back really cleanly and clearly to those who support us. So our messaging, we're turning up the volume on our role as advocates. WaterAid was established by the UK water industry. We're engineers to our core, and we're very proud of that. But it's what underpins us. We are the engineers, we're the conveners, but we're also the advocates for change. We are ensuring that system strengthening approach does come through in our communications. There was a bit of a myth that, oh, you just dig a well, or you only put in a tap. Well, absolutely, that's part of our work. But we're also looking at system strengthening and change to enable a future where hopefully WaterAid won't have to exist. We're sharpening our focus on water. Huge discussion. What about sanitation? What about hygiene? Well, it starts with water and then it enables the others to follow. And we're capturing and embedding our core belief that change starts with water. It also shows up in how we look moving forwards. We really needed to ensure we've got greater consistency in brand recognition. It's a really challenging climate out there at the moment to get cut through. So we needed to be much bolder, cleaner and simpler in our approach. And we also wanted to ensure that we're centering our photo and film at the heart of the brand. This is where we're really seeing the people-led part of who we are as WaterAid really showing up in how we approach this. So I'm about to show you a really short explainer of the brand. This launched at the end of January globally to WaterAid staff. So what I'm sharing with you is what we shared to staff. So it's not for external consumption.
That's wonderful. As someone who once upon a time ran a marathon for WaterAid, I do encourage you to do so. No, very moving. Thank you. I'm intrigued that that's for your staff, though. I assumed that when I saw it was for the public. Anyway, we'll have that discussion later. I'd like to. So, does that work for everybody, or are there other lessons that we should take from other sectors? I'm just going to dare to go to you next, Dan, if that's okay. Tell us, we heard earlier that environment and climate change is maybe a way into engagement. Are there lessons we can be learning from you?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me today. I found it extremely interesting so far this morning. I think that although our sectors are maybe operating in some different contexts, I think there is something which we've really picked up this morning about the challenge which I think is shared, where we're trying to turn what is a huge issue, a global issue, into something which we can motivate supporters with today in Scotland. One of the things which I think with the environment has always been an issue with, and over time, people are increasingly aware that climate change is happening, that it's happening in the here and now, that it's impacting on their own lives, and they can see that and experience that in their everyday lives. But there is a challenge of psychological distance. So that psychological distancing, it can be temporal, so it can be to do with time. We can feel that climate change is a problem which is going to happen way off in the future, or in some cases, some people might think about biodiversity loss and nature loss as something which has happened away in the past. Psychological distance can also be spatial. It can be people can feel that these issues are happening far away. It can also be cultural. It's about, are these issues impacting people that are like me, like the community that I live in, like my neighbours, my friends? How we can deal with this in the environmental context is that we try and take these big issues and we try and localise them and make people understand that they are actually happening in their own communities and impacting people like them. So, for example, if we were trying to speak to the general public about huge issues with climate change, although people can be very motivated about that issue, it is something which can seem daunting. It can cause people to feel an enormous sense of unease. People can disengage deliberately as a sort of protection mechanism. But if you talk to people about the fact that their river is full of sewage or that their local park is full of litter, then people can feel very motivated. And that sort of closing of psychological distance, I think, is an enormously important thing which we can do as a sector, and to motivate people about environmental issues and to make people understand that actually these are problems which are impacting them, impacting their communities and people like them, but they're also happening all over the world. And that the change starts at home, and that we can work for global change by having that action in Scotland. So there's obviously different contexts there for the development sector, but I do think that that core idea that trying to close that psychological gap and make people understand that this is actually impacting on people that are like them, that there are shared interests, if that sort of sense of solidarity across borders is perhaps a message that you might be able to take.
Thank you. Climate justice is at the heart of everything everybody's doing, actually. So thank you. But like the joining the local and the international, we try and do that. We try and argue for that a lot. Francisca, I'm sure that working on diseases really means that you have to reach out to the public so that they understand. Maybe you can share some of your insights with us.
Great, thank you very much. That is on. So yes, we work for a partnership called TIBA, Tackling Infections to Benefit Africa, and that didn't come easily. I'd like to share a few lessons from that with a little bit of context. TIBA was one of the first research units set up in the UK, funded through order funding. So this was one of the GCRF units, and we were given £7 million through NIHR. And what we set out to do was unashamedly to show how you can do international development research in a way that has never been done before and actually deliver. So the first thing about TIBA is we were concerned about the lack of distinction between humanitarian aid and development finance, development aid. And I noticed that earlier today, and even in this room, we still are tussling between that. If we don't understand it ourselves and we don't articulate it clearly amongst ourselves, we are not going to be able to take the public with us. So that's very important, because the thing with humanitarian aid is that it's not very altruistic. I mean, you're doing that to help somebody without expecting anything in return. So this is what we do in terms of crisis. This is what we're going to have to do in order to manage the current issues arising from USAID cuts in terms of health and nutrition. Then there is development research, which is the long-term aspect. And we wanted to showcase how you do development finance, because this impacts everybody. And in health, it's very easy. For the diseases we work in, controlling them in Africa is a global health security issue. And when I tell Scottish people that, the first thing they say is, what can I do to ensure that I'm protecting not just the people in Africa, but myself? Yeah. So this is where our narrative has to be very clear. So what we did in TIBA was to say, right, let's go ahead and show how this is done. The first thing is that the work has to be responsive. If you're wanting to have long-term impact, you have to be responding to the priorities of the people you're trying to help, not your own. The second thing is to give agency. People have to be able to help themselves. And that's where local leadership is really critical, and we've done that in TIBA. The third thing is it's got to be catalytic. You can't solve the problem. No countries develop through aid, but you can't give them the catalyst to develop. And we showcased that with TIBA, with a spectacular activity that we did, where we talked to all our 9 partner African countries and said, what do we need? What do you need the most to help your country's health systems? And they said, we need to be able to sequence for surveillance. This was 2018. We taught the countries to do that. 2019, not only did they know how to do that, we made sure that they had all the equipment to do that. 2020 came, COVID arrived, all our partners' programs were nationalized. Every single African country that we started off with a small amount of £100,000 nationalized those programs so that they could sequence their own SARS-CoV-2. We provided through the TIBA partnership 15% of Africa's sequences. And we were not involved, the countries did it in-house. So that's what catalytic means. And then finally, you have to have an exit strategy. So we established TIBA in 2017, and all of us sat down and said, our definition of failure in 5 years' time is if we're still in the same job. If we still have our jobs, it means we have not done the right thing in capacitating everybody on the ground. That is absolutely critical. And the reason for that is when you fail to do that, what you do is perceived as self-preservation. And you also create a long-term culture of dependence. And with that comes learned helplessness. So we were really trying to avoid that. And as TIBA, we've really worked hard to ensure that we ensured how to do this the way we thought from the beginning. And yeah, we're unashamedly very proud of that. And I'll pass on. I have lots of other examples to show and any other aspects you would like to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you. There are already some questions online which are in line with what you've just said. So you're in a shared audience here. Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Mark, who's going to share his views.
Thanks very much. How do I follow that? I need to try and come up with something in terms of what public health instead. So delighted to be here, and I think just the example of Dan was referenced there in terms of how do we take that international and make it local is really resonates with me, and particularly in terms of our experience in terms of the pandemic, in terms of actually how we were compelled to work together to kind of focus internationally. Just the example there in terms of the work that's been led by Scotland and Africa is a real kind of shining light in terms of what that's been done. From a public health perspective, in terms of messaging and engaging the public, I think there's something I just maybe want to kind of feed in. You will all be aware of how some of our kind of public health messaging has changed over the last 30, 40 years, particularly about some of those kind of big health issues that we always talk about: smoking, tobacco, alcohol. And you can think about back in our lifetime how that messaging has shifted and resonated with the public and how it's moved and changed. What's really driven that has been a persistence and a consistency in terms of driving at trying to transform and change that, being evidence-based in what we do, being really consistent in terms of our messaging, building effective collaborations across different partners in terms of making that happen, and being really kind of focused in terms of actually kind of driving that change. It's taken time, and I think there's a bit there, but we all need to recognise that to drive the change we want to do, it's about persistence and time. There's not a quick fix to any of this stuff. We need to be really focused within that. But I think there's a real shift in terms of, from a public health perspective, in terms of the narrative in Scotland in particular, and by extension, I think internationally as well. I've never seen in Scotland as much interest and emphasis in terms of how do you move into that prevention space as a system now. So I think what we've said is we're really cracked in terms of the messaging and kind of getting buy-in, that we know what we can do in terms of tobacco, and we've seen the change we can make legislatively in terms of doing that. We're doing the same in terms of alcohol. As a nation, we've led that in many instances, and I'm really kind of keen that we kind of continue to lead that. It's challenging in the environment we're in just now, but I think there is a kind of real opportunity to do that. What we need to kind of shift there in terms of, and this is where it's really difficult, is kind of shift from that individualistic way of thinking about health into that kind of wider social determinant space. And that's when we start to kind of push into spaces like climate change, climate justice, the economy, how we work in terms of housing, how we do stuff in terms of tackling poverty, etc. And that's where I think there's really strong collaborative alliances we need to be building, not just in Scotland, but UK-wide, but also internationally as well. We've undertaken a kind of piece of work, which you can access with Frameworks UK, which is an international organisation, but a UK office, to think about how do we talk about issues about housing, how do we talk about issues about the economy, how do we talk about issues about poverty, to kind of make that relationship straight back to health and what that means from a policy perspective. I think the key message from that has been really to say, what's the causality between the link between housing, why does housing drive health, what's the link within that, but more importantly, what's the solution that we're actually advocating for within that. It's very easy in terms of a messaging to be kind of narratives of doom and kind of consistently say this is the problem, and public health is really good at that. We're really good at saying this is the challenge, it's the problem. What we're not always as good at is saying here's the solution, here's what you can do in your own power and within your own agency, here's what we can do as agencies ourselves, and here's what we can do politically as well. So there's something really important in terms of our messaging, in terms of actually really persistence, about collaboration in terms of what we do, thinking really purposely in terms of actually how we make that message really driven in terms of change and transformation, and really about what people can change within that as well. So I would encourage you to kind of look at the work that we're doing with Frameworks UK. I can provide a link to colleagues, but that's really driving a lot of what we're doing as an organisation. And that, I think, is driven why we've seen a really strong shift in terms of policy, in terms of that prevention space, a really strong link in terms of the work in poverty and public health, a really strong link in terms of the work in economy. That's been fundamentally driven by how we have shifted as an organisation in terms of talking about health, and how we, by extension, are working with our Scottish Government colleagues and colleagues in here and local government in terms of actually what the resonance within that. So I'm happy to expand on that as we go through the conversation, but I think that's just some kind of quick reflections from me.
Thank you. Mark has actually unwittingly answered quite a few of the questions there, because quite a few of the questions were about how do you target? Should you be being more positive rather than always being negative, which I think was what you were hinting at. But I think the question of how do you deal with all these complex issues? Do you focus on one thing, or do you try and engage a broader public? And what language do you use? There's quite a lot of questions about in here about how do we, there's a problem that we aides speak, but sometimes we do have to speak. We are seeking to do the strategic systems change, so we need to do some of that speaking as well. So how do we balance that? So I don't know if anybody wanted to comment on all of those. And there is one slightly mean question, Gemma, but I think we need to answer it. Why 40 years on, half the world still doesn't have clean water?
That question to Gemma. Just to expand slightly what I was saying, so I take housing as a really good example in terms of how do you target the messaging? Do you stay broad? I think you can do both. And I think there's a bit about how we've tried to kind of approach things to talk about the impact of housing on health is this. By extension, if you intervene, and this is what the impact it has on health in terms of actually, if it's mould in housing, it's got respiratory issues, or whatever it be, you try and bring it down to something that's tangible and real, but you're talking about the wider that you need to invest in that as a kind of building block of health more consistently. So it's something about you can do both within that. And I think it's just about honing the messaging about it and being consistent in that messaging and making sure that it permeates through all of your communications and your branding and your marketing, that what you do as well. And there's something really interesting in terms of when you're talking about branding earlier on. When we set up Public Health Scotland, one of the things we were really keen to think about is what is our brand, what's our identity, and it's very easy to slip into, we're about health. And then that's great because that has our own audience and everybody engages with that understands that. But if you're trying to kind of build influence across different parts of national government or local government or the third sector or the community sector, you start talking much more in a way which actually engages them as a whole. So we talked about Scotland as a nation, about how we want the nation to thrive, how we want to kind of think about more consistently about what we can do together, how can we work better as a system, and try and move away from talking about health as a standalone issue, and look at integrating what we do. And that permeates through all the work we do, whether it's in housing, the economy, tackling poverty. Start broad and wide and talk about the issue and then bring it down into actually what it means in terms of an individual or an organisation or a locality. So I think you can do both within that, but it just needs to be a consistency in terms of doing that. I'll pass it to Gemma for the hard question. There you go.
Thank you. So just on the language side, I thought I'd pick up on that part first, that within our brand refresh work, it's very much that to your technical audiences and to those your influences within your technical space. Very much straightforward, determined, motivated still means you can use all of the technical jargon we'll be using in this room today, I'm sure. So the way we've approached that really practically is the JMP data that we use here at WaterAid. We've now got 2 sections.
You're going to have to tell us what JMP stands for.
Monitoring program.
The joint monitoring programme that brings together all of the data across, not just for water, it's much wider. And that's the global benchmarking for progress. And that is super technical. So we have discussions whether, can we say clean water? Does it have to be safely managed? Or what do you mean by toilet versus lots of other different definitions. So what we've actually done at WaterAid is to ensure that we can have that technical aspect to our work, advocacy systems change part, that's 100% still the terminology we'll be using. But we've also looked at it from a mass engagement perspective to really distill it back down to keep it as simple as possible so it's easy to access. Why is WaterAid still here 40 years on? The job's not done. As the data shows us, there's still an inequality that we face with access to clean water, decent toilets, and good hygiene. Probably similar to a lot of the causes that you are working on here in the room. I wish I could stand here and say our job is done. We're in a very changing context here at the moment, and really good timing to be talking about reliance on aid. It's how we come together equally as partners to solve some of these bigger systemic questions we're trying to tackle. WaterAid isn't set up to be existing forever, and I should think none of the organisations you represent here in the room are here set up in that way either. We've got a lot more work ahead of us, but I think the global strategy is really pointing us into a much more ambitious direction. I was in a meeting the other day about, okay, so we've got this big philanthropic trust coming in. How can we use that as a blueprint to show this programme for it to be taken on to national, which is really interesting what you're saying about, well, actually during COVID, we saw that this was working and then it got taken on to national level. So there's a lot of that underpinning our global strategy, and then we have country level strategies underneath that as well. We're all pointing in the same direction, so hopefully that in 40 years' time we're not having this same conversation.
5 years was a target that Francisca offered us. Yeah. Then, oh, sorry, Francisca, go on.
Sorry, you asked a question about how do we articulate our messages to different groups of people, and there are many strategies to use, and I just thought I would share our approach for what we have done in TIBA. We work on neglected tropical diseases. The word tells you already they are neglected. They are diseases of neglected people, which a lot of us sitting in different would probably not consider your problem. But this is how we bring it home to Scotland and to the UK. We make it relevant to all the areas of interest, and we work cross sector. So I thought I'll give you an example. There are 21 neglected tropical diseases. I'm going to give you an example of one that some of you might have heard of. It is called schistosomiasis, which is a right pain, because as soon as you say that, people switch off. But the common name is bilharzia or snail fever. So when we talk to different sectors in Scotland, I just thought I'll pick up a couple of examples. First of all, it's a disease of travelers. When you travel to tropical countries, you can catch this disease. It is a disease that affects us across all financial and economic status. And my poster boy for that is Prince William, because he contracted that at a nice, exotic, exclusive resort in Kenya, and came back and had to travel to Glasgow to be treated for that. And about 100 to 150 Scottish school children come back with bilharzia every year, usually actually on these school trips to Malawi. Okay, so as soon as you have that context, people wake up and think, okay, this is important when we travel. If we put it in the climate change context, we now have a local foresight for the transmission of this disease in France. Okay, so when you go on your nice holidays to France, you might catch bilharzia. Okay, and that is because of the changes in the foresight, changes in movements of people, and changes in climate. That is closer to home. When I talk about antimicrobial resistance, quite a few of these diseases are treated with antibiotics. The way we treat the diseases is called mass drug administration. You go into a population of people, regardless of whether or not they're infected, you give them the drugs. That drives drug resistance. And part of our AMR stewardship issue globally is to reduce the use of antibiotics. So if we can eliminate these diseases, we reduce antibiotic consumption, and we make those antibiotics safe for us because they're used in our operations and in a lot of the diseases we control in this country. Next one is pandemic preparedness. The countries where these diseases occur, these are the sort of largest health burden. That means they have to put a lot of resources to these diseases. Where does the money come from? It comes from cutting surveillance. So if we don't have surveillance in low to middle income countries for diseases, we cannot pick up emerging diseases quickly, and therefore we don't have early warning science for this. So if we can get rid of these diseases, we get that investment in surveillance and disease prevention, that makes all of us safe. So it is a global health security issue. And finally, sexual and reproductive health. When some of us travel and we contract these diseases, particularly bilharzia, one of its impacts is it affects fertility. It's called female genital schistosomiasis. A lot of people in the UK who have traveled and from African countries who have problems conceiving and with fertility end up being diagnosed with FGS. So these are things that come home to us. Forget about what's happening in the African countries. This is happening in Scotland, and you should be interested in that.
I think all the other three panelists have in their own way touched upon the idea of pitching our areas of interest to the areas of interest of your audience, which is, I agree with everything that was said. I think that's a good approach. I do want to add a small caveat to that, which is, I think sometimes as campaigners, there is a risk that we are led away from what we care about to whatever the government of the day priority is. So, the government says they've got a mission to do this, or they've got a new buzzword, or whatever it is, we all suddenly start talking about, the whole third sector is talking about, the wellbeing economy, or community wealth building, or, the UK government missions, or whatever it is. And sometimes this is going to be relevant and it's a way in the door, and that's fine. But I think that we do need to make sure that we're not being led by other people in a way which is distracting from our priorities. As an example from my own sector, there are insider people, people in government, politicians, who are really interested when we talk about nature restoration and the idea of green jobs. The general public are not particularly persuaded by that. If you do research on this, people don't really know what a green job is. They don't really feel that they're likely to get one. Actually, what the research shows is that when you talk to people in Scotland about nature restoration, where they see the overlap is you see it in climate resilience, which they really understand, plant trees, protect yourself from climate change, simple message. And they see it in health and well-being. That's actually the number one thing that they understand. So I'm really confident that we can talk to public audiences about nature restoration through those lenses, and it's going to resonate. But I think that actually a really good example of this is I felt that the WaterAid branding, when it was very clear what the priority was, it was led by the priority, but then when it starts talking about other issues, it's talking about education in a way where I think, a general audience can see that, and they can see why that additional issue is resonating with the core purpose.
I've got lots of questions, but I'd also encourage people to stick their hands up as well, because that helps them feel lively. So yes, go on.
Yes, so there's been a lot of talk about how, the goal of a lot of this work should be, not to exist. And we're also talking about, how to present kind of show people that there's value for money, that work is actually useful, and how to convey that. I feel like anytime, I've done a lot of work in charities, and I feel like that message often comes up a lot internally, but you don't see it spoken about as much externally in terms of our goal is eventually not to have to exist. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on whether that's an effective thing to bring into external messaging, how to bring it, and if so, kind of how to bring it in, because you don't want to say it in a way that minimizes the importance of your work. But I realize it's quite a difficult tapestry to figure out how to weave that in. But yeah, I was just curious on your thoughts there, and if that does, if people think that would be one way of illustrating value for money or efficacy and benefit of international work.
I'll take that since, as we say in TIBA, we attend this voting for Christmas. So the issue is not to lessen the importance of what you do. That's really important. For us, the issue was what we want to do is to empower the local people, because we are being catalytic. And so TIBA still exists, but we all have slightly different jobs, because what we've done is localized a lot of those jobs. So it's really important. The narrative is, what is our exit strategy? So in our case, partners from 9 African countries, we sat down at inception and said, what are we trying to achieve? What is our exit strategy? How do we ensure that in 5 years' time, we have empowered all the local team players and we have replaced ourselves. And what happens with that kind of thing is a lot of the metrics that we put in as structural from the beginning can really hinder what we're trying to do. So here is a partnership. We're working in Africa, and one of the big things in African partnerships, especially funded from abroad, is brain drain. And from the onset, you get a lot of funders who say, "Oh, what's your strategy for retaining, for reducing brain drain?" We didn't do it that way. We just built ourselves in such a way that working locally and remaining in those countries was so attractive that not only did we have zero brain drain, we had negative brain drain, because we have people from the UK thinking, "Wow, what a fantastic structure, the way this has been set up, and it's now being locally led, we are attracted to go and work there." So I hope that encourages you that, please, we're not saying disappear today. What we're saying is, let's think of the exit strategies that make us really have impact, be catalytic, and move on to the next thing. Thanks.
We have quite a lot of questions about we should be more political and more activists. Some of this will be in the workshop, I think one of the workshops at least later, about being more political, but I don't know if others feel we should be a bit more political in this space.
So I think it's challenging for me as a kind of public health organisation in terms of actually being directly funded through government. So we have got kind of really strong, clear role about being independent in terms of evidence that we provide, etc. But engaging in that kind of political space is not for us. What we need to be doing, be independent, evidence-driven in what we do, consistent in terms of what we do that, and be really transparent and upfront, and then we present that evidence so it is equally accessible and applicable to all kind of political parties within that. What we are really keen to do is kind of work collaboratively with organisations, and each of us bring different assets and strengths to those engagements. So we've got a really good example just now. We're doing really lots of good work with colleagues on things like the European Sustainable Development legislation, looking to bring our expertise and evidence to that, married up with the expertise and experience that other partners can do, who can do different things than what we can do as an organisation. And I think equally we can do different things there as well. So I think there is a bit about looking at how we exert as much influence in terms of policy as we can. There's different ways in which we can do that. And we are really keen that our role is actually to be that independent, evidence-driven organisation to kind of make sure policy that's developed is driven by that evidence, and that's as transparent and as consistent as we can be within that. Others may have different views in terms of how to influence that, but
yeah, I think there's always really a need to do both, where you have on the one hand the inside track, evidence-led advocacy, where relationships are important. Often you're funded by the government in some way to do the work, with the more vocal public campaigning. What I would say as an external observer of this sector is that the fact that the UK government felt comfortable making such dramatic cuts to the aid budget is a result of the fact that they see that as having no political risk or very low political risk. And the way that you reverse that situation is to be more political. Campaigning works, being loud works, becoming a problem that government wants to get off their desk works. There was a research done recently where it was a meta-analysis of, I think, 50 different studies that looked at climate protests, which was everything from sort of marches to some of the more direct action work. It works, it changes public opinion, even if people get very annoyed by it sometimes. Over the long term, if you can have a consistent political approach to campaigning, it does make a difference.
And there's a challenge. Anybody in the room like to answer that challenge? No? Yes, Mark, go on.
I think that, context in which we're having this discussion has changed so significantly, even since January this year, is that there really feels to be like a real need to rethink our approaches in the civic society because of the level of threat. And so I'm a community educator. So for me, there was no such thing as being apolitical, especially in issues of inequality and health. So it's what you're talking about maybe as being party political, But this idea that there's some kind of neutrality in the place of oppression is, you know, is the old one about the elephant standing on the the mouse's tail or whatever. So that need for engagement with democracy and disengagement from democracy is surely fundamental to the issues we're discussing here. Because if we cannot make the link between social justice in our own country and global social justice, then we will not shift the dial on these issues. So I just think, you know, also obviously as an educator, but in many ways we're all educators here. And this is one of the fundamental discussions that's going on about the curriculum in Scotland. And most of us aren't at the table. But I think that there really needs to be a shift in this real focus on these issues, because we realise the rise of the far right is accelerating. Therefore, we are left with no choice, and we would all want to accelerate our roles anyway. But I think that to try and say that the reason why the Labour Party cut the media, so it's cut the aid grant and increased the spending on weapons, largely predicated on reform voters, which again only at most represent 20%. So there's a real need for us to articulate and be engaged in those civic spaces and those political spaces.
Sorry, go on.
No, I just wanted to add to that because I think I completely agree, but I think there is that maybe the elephant in the room of, but we depend mainly on grant funding, and the people that usually tend to grant fund us are possibly the government, and so there's a tension between how do you strike the right balance of being a critical friend, but also and entering into that political space, which we absolutely have to. And then, like, you know, sorry, I don't know your name over there, but how our colleague there is saying that, you know, it just shows you that that decision to be made to take all that funding away is just not, it was like an easy one. So what does that say about our capacity to have that very serious, strong conversation about government and how they fund us and how they support us as a sector, considering how we support international aid as well as domestic stuff at home?
There's a question online. I don't know if I think this takes us a little bit further forward. So how do we get beyond arguments about charity at home, beginning at home, and people thinking about things closer to home? I think, Francisca, you answered it in a way about how you communicate about it, but I think they're trying to get at something maybe a little bit beyond that. Otherwise, no, please raise your hand. I'm obviously failing to distill that question very well. Gemma, go on.
That a question based around an either or approach, which I definitely in sort of our recent times, it's definitely felt, and the rhetoric is definitely like, oh, you should choose either home or abroad. Like it's very like divisive. And actually, as a sector, we're not saying you can't support at home, but 100%, of course you can support at home. So it's like how in our messaging and approach, when we are discussing cuts to aid or opportunities for funding, but it's not what you were saying earlier about bond. We don't want to be competing against ourselves. We don't want it to be a choice of either or. So I think it's how can we change that rhetoric, that it's not about you can only choose one or the other. You can do both.
I think Lewis has got a question about, or a point about linking those things up. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry, Lewis is from Oxfam, and for those that don't know.
Yeah, so a couple of things I wanted to say. The first was about the decision by the Labour government. In fact, Francis, you and I were in a room with MPs when that announcement was made, and one MP sat there and said, Starmer's ratings will go up as a result of this. So it's not just about reform voters, and I want to be really clear about that. This is a much bigger problem. And so that question about charity starting at home, for me, it's an interesting concept, because should this be about charity at all? And we talked earlier, Kirsty made some really useful points around, you know, some of the more hidden stuff, the systemic stuff. You know, we're not linking those systemic issues back to the domestic enough, in my opinion. So it's actually reversing that question altogether. Why aren't we talking about, as development NGOs, the two-child limit? and that ridiculous decision to keep that? Why aren't we talking about benefit cuts that have just come in, as well as the international aid agency? The moment we start linking those two things, then we start to have somebody to blame, and the right are good at blaming people. We need to be better at blaming people. And so I wonder, going back to that political question, whether or not there is something we can learn from the other side in terms of using the energy of the distrust that some feel for the NGO sector to channel that somewhere else. And I wonder what the panel thinks about
that. I think it's a really interesting point, and I think that it's not always easy, but this idea of having a villain as a campaigning organisation, having somebody to point to as the problem, is something which you're right. The far right are much better at it than sometimes progressive voices are. I think that we are living in an era of zero-sum politics. I mean, I keep on hearing the idea of trade-offs even this morning. There's a reason why so much of political discussion, and down from Donald Trump not understanding how trade works, down to the fact that politics is dominated by ideas about levels of immigration, about welfare cuts. It all feeds into this idea, which is, I think, really widely held, particularly, and it's a process which I would say probably started around about 2008, but particularly since the cost of living crisis, that it's very easy for people to feel that if somebody else has something, it's because they don't have it. And if they have something, it's because they've only got it because somebody else has been denied that. And that's extremely challenging for anybody who wants something, wants to have a government that is spending money tackling poverty at home and abroad to operate in that environment. But it is possible. I think some of it does come to that, down to those more fundamental issues about how we campaign, about how we can point fingers and find good villains to point at. Elon Musk's a pretty easy one, but it's not going to work in every scenario. But I think it's a good starting point. And one of the things I would say is I've highlighted the issue of immigration and social security as examples of sort of the zero-sum mentality dominating politics from the right. But even on the left, if I was to think about what is the big idea on the left just now, and it's wealth taxation. And ultimately, whether you support wealth taxation or not, and I do think it's a very good thing, that also is a zero-sum approach to politics, is we're trying to take something off somebody to give it to everybody else. And so there's ways that we can operate in that environment, but it does need, I think, quite a fundamental analysis of where we are and how we can get out of it.
Thank you. Okay, we'll have a couple more from the room, although that was a great potential point to finish on. Well,
I just wanted to change tack a little bit. I've been in this lot for quite a long time, and it often ends up with a lot of hand-wringing, and isn't the world awful, and why, and is there 40% of the world still don't have clean water, and woe is me. And I think sometimes I miss Hans Rosling, who used to be, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a fantastic economist who died and used to show the world in a different light. We have achieved an immense amount of change over the last 60 years. And I think we don't do enough. So in the previous speaker before Coffee, it was very much about people feeling there's a benefit for them. We very seldom, nobody opens their newspapers to find good news, right? And yet there's a ton of amazing stuff. And Francisca, I really appreciated your interventions because they were about stuff that we've achieved. I get things from things I sign saying, well done, you stopped that whale getting killed or whatever it was. And I go, did I? Wow. But I think there is a point at which our communications need to be more about, we have done amazing things. I'm very closely linked to what's going on in Sudan. We should all be celebrating the amazing community activity that is going on in Sudan to save millions of lives right now. Not because we're doing stuff, but because they are. So I just want to throw that back in, that we've got time to celebrate the change and the actions that we take. And that might help the engagement with harder discussions about finding them.
Please, thank you. Can I come back to that? I like good news stories. And for those of us working in neglected tropical diseases, please may I give you a good news story to take away. In 2012, we started uniting to combat NTDs. And one of the things we were working towards was the London Declaration on NTDs. And this was a declaration that was made by several heads of state, the World Health Organization, to try and reduce the number of people affected by NTDs. It's 1.7 billion people in the world. And that meeting was held in London. In 2022, I attended the Commonwealth Heads of State meeting where we launched the Kigali Declaration on NTDs. Now, two things. First of all, it was started in London, a lot of international people with leadership from London. And again, it was one of these processes where it really should be in the affected countries. And therefore, the baton was handed to Rwanda and it became the Kigali Declaration of NTDs. So we then started to take stock of what we had achieved in those 10 years. And just recently, we had the report of this. Now, in 2020, the WHO set a target of 100 countries eliminating at least one neglected tropical disease by 2030. We're halfway there. But as of yesterday, with the efforts from the London Declaration and the Kigali Declaration, 54 countries in the world have eliminated at least one NTD. That is due to all the advocacy we did from the London Declaration. So I think we deserve a round of applause for this. And for us, we always say that is a good news story because before that and before the input of all the NGOs and all the international partners, 10 years ago, not a single country had eliminated one NTD. The Gambia has eliminated 4. So there we go. So good news story for you.
Yay! Thank you. Okay, it's a great note to leave. Oh, you want to get your last question? All right, go on, but you're not allowed to spoil the.
I certainly agree with the importance of positive messaging. However, I just want to pick up. No, this is not a negative point. I want to pick up what Sue Min Oh said about inequality being the issue that was of second highest concern among Scottish people. And I want to pick up what Kirsty Smith said about the pivot issues. She mentioned debt servicing, illicit tax flows, and fossil fuel penalties. Picking up on inequality, illicit tax flows, and the vast increase in wealth on an individual level, I think we should all, across the development sector, across UK social wellbeing charities, have a standard clause at the front of all our press releases, on all our websites, highlighting the fundamental structural problem of growing inequality, possibly illustrated graphically, because really capitalism, to put another term in there, but actually growing inequality is the fundamental issue, and people resent it. They're motivated by that. We've got the evidence. There's no, well, we can't afford this in development support because we've got problems here. When you put it in the context of the vast amount of wealth being concentrated by a wealthy few people who unscrupulously wield power and influence and control our media. So let's just have a standard, I'm sure it can be worked out, clause that we all use to highlight the fundamental underlying issue.
Thank you. I think we do have a plan now to move into some workshops to drill down on some of this. So I'd like to thank the panel enormously for that. And thank you all too, because I think we had some very clear takeaways. Be positive, be catalytic, be collaborative, be transparent, and be clear. And maybe we could get the water aid clarity thing for his messaging. I'm sure there's some collaboration we could do that. All right. So we have 3 workshops. Workshop 1, I've just got to get this right because otherwise I'll send you to the wrong place and that would be very shocking. On global citizenship is in the Scott room, and workshop 2 on AI strategy is in the Burns room, and both of those are on the first floor. up the stairs. And the third workshop on advocacy will be in here, so there'll be a bit of reshuffling, and then that's it. We're not coming back together, so I would like to take this opportunity to thank everybody, all speakers, and for our key sponsors, WaterAid, but they taught us something as well, WaterAid and StoneX. And the plan, the aim is to be down here for lunch at 1:30, so that's up to your facilitators. Thank you.